Good evening. So for those of you who haven't yet found your seats, there are plenty of seats on this side of the room. Invite you to join us. We're in line for a great treat here this evening. Well, good evening and welcome. I'm UC Santa Cruz Chancellor Cynthia LaRive, and I thank you for joining us tonight for the 21st Sidhartha Maitra Memorial Lecture. Yeah, I think we should applaud for that. The Maitra Lecture is among our premier lecture series. It has brought renowned thinkers to UC Santa Cruz, enriching the intellectual life of our campus and of the greater community. It is a moment when we can all come together to deeply consider the issues of our time, and to do so from a humanist perspective. Over the years, Maitra Series speakers have offered us great insights on a host of topics. Lectures include writers, academics, scientists, artists, a Nobel laureate economist, Janet Yellen, the former U.S. Treasury Secretary and one-time chair of the Federal Reserve, was our speaker. Amartya Sen, the Indian economist and philosopher, has been a speaker. And our last speaker was Dr. Sidhartha Maitra, a writer and historian of Indian art and culture. We owe thanks to a number of people for this series. Kiran and Rajan Malhotra's generous gift established the endowment. They established the endowment that has supported this series for more than 2 decades now. Thank you, Kiran. And we have deep gratitude for entrepreneur and businesswoman Anu Luther. Anu has been a great friend of UC Santa Cruz. She is a current UC Santa Cruz Foundation trustee, a former foundation president. She is an economist herself and also taught economics for us. And she launched this series to honor her late husband, Sid Maitra. Sid was a scientist, an entrepreneur, and a philanthropist, and a man of great vision, and he had deep appreciation for the humanities. This lecture series is a wonderful legacy in that it preserves Sid's memory while expanding all of our horizons. So join me in welcoming Anu Luther, who will tell you more about the lecture series and about tonight's distinguished speaker.
Thank you, Chancellor. UCSC Chancellor and I have been introducing the series for 25 years, and each time a new metaphor or image suggests itself to me. This year it was the phoenix, representing renewal and born in ashes, to me, a single mom, with Kiran and Rajan Malhotra as doulas, and then nurtured into a confident adulthood by UCSC leadership, represented today by Chancellor Cindy LaRive. The economics department is here in full force. Thank you so much. And a former chancellor, George Blumenthal, is here. Our provost, Lori Kletz, is here, and thank you very much. And Mark Davis, our vice chancellor, is also here. I know I saw him earlier, so thank you, Mark. And so very ably staffed by Kristen Palmer. I think she's been with me from the outset, and Nicole Silva, who's also here. So thank you very much. This bird is now loved and respected, no longer bounced from one department to another, and I don't have to press friends to show up for the lectures. The roster of speakers is just plain wow. Thank you very much, Cindy, Mark, Laurie and Ken, Nirvikar, Kristen, Michael, Nirvikar, Michael, Kristen, Nicole. And thank you, Kiran, and all our friends, some of whom have been coming every year for 25 years. Sonia and Krishna, Shobna, Neeru and Pravesh. I don't think they're here yet, but they will be. Kishan and Amita, who also, I think, they're just coming in, just to get the acknowledgement. But if I haven't named you, please forgive me. If you are here, you are as important. Thank you. Thank you also to our sponsors, India House Foundation, Executive Director Nida Hassan, and Board Member Shilpan Mehta, who are here. Thank you. The Center for South Asia Studies, Director Dolly Kekon will be the first to hold the Sidhartha Maitra Endowed Professorship in South Asia Studies. Thank you, Tom. That woke him up. And the Humanities Institute. Finally, may I introduce both the oldest member of our family, my father, Jagdish Luther, 101 years old, and he made a real effort to come here today. Also an economist bureaucrat who served at the Reserve Bank of India many years ago as the deputy governor there. And the youngest, my grandchildren, Ryan, Rafa, Taj, here on a school night, escorted by their parents, Sonali and Julio, and our eldest grandchild, Dea, with her husband, Stephen. Thank you. Stephen calls me affectionately, I think, the whoever, whatever, why-ever gal. I usually roll my eyes at his characterization of my dismissive attitude about celebrities. Yet today, I will use the who, what, why theme to demonstrate that I'm not all around dismissive, just discriminating. I actively pursued Professor Raghuram Rajan, and I thank my own professor and my friend Amartya Sen for helping bring someone of Raghu's caliber to us. So who is he? Raghu is the Catherine Dusick Miller Distinguished Service Professor of Finance at Chicago School of Business. His other past life employments have included the IMF, Chief Economist at age 40, the Government of India, Economic Advisor to the PM, Chief Economist in the Finance Ministry, Governor of RBI, the Reserve Bank of India. That's impressive enough on its own, but what makes him a standout are his accomplishments and contributions in those roles. At the IMF, he integrated the financial sector into the analysis and introduced modern modeling and techniques. He questioned the benefit of aid inflows for recipient countries and creatively assisted them to reduce their budget imbalances. And for the fund itself, he wisely stayed the fiscal austerity course. And Raghu, please feel free to contradict me when I say something wrong, because this was done purely from reading what you've written and what about you. So, and some of those things I know can be a little wrong. But when I looked at what he accomplished in his Government of India days, I can't imagine that he slept very much. He started with a succession of top-level advisory roles, chaired a committee to fix regulatory gaps and improve access, and was responsible for the 2012 Economic Survey of India. Then, as it should have, came his reward and real challenge. He was appointed RBI's 23rd governor. In keeping with his missionary zeal to tap the potential of regulated financial markets, he implemented policies to deepen, widen, and rationalize India's financial sector. Like America's legendary Paul Volcker, he believed that the central bank's primary checks and balances responsibility in a modern economy is to rein in inflation. His policies spectacularly accomplished that. Foreign exchange reserves also surged during his lifetime, during his tenure. While on the subject of rewards and glories, may I mention a few others. In India and the US, he attended the most elite, which translates into very competitive schools and institutions, IIT, IIM, MIT. He was always the top student in his graduating class, and several of those distinctions were minted into gold medals. 2003, the inaugural Fisher Black Prize awarded to an economist younger than 40 who has made the most significant contribution to the theory and practice of finance. 2010, Financial Times Goldman Sachs Business Book of the Year Award for Fault Lines, How Hidden Fractures Still Threaten the World Economy. 2016, Time Magazine's 100 Most Influential People in the World. Finally, something that may be Raghu's secret gloat, 3 years before the 2008 financial crash, he publicly warned his peers that increasing inequality, subprime lending, excessive risk-taking, and regulatory laxness had the makings of a perfect storm, a clusterfuck. I was told, I was warned, do not use that word in front of your kids. And I said, I'm more worried about using it in front of the chancellor. So forgive me. My kids will probably think I'm cool. But it's all over the internet. What is today's topic? The Industrial Revolution that started in Britain in the 18th century and led to unprecedented increases in productivity and prosperity for the West was a result of an organic process, decades, even centuries in the making. But the near foundation of it was the glorious revolution that established parliamentary sovereignty and with it inclusive institutions that encouraged innovation and entrepreneurship. Much later, Japan, the Asia Tiger countries, and then China repeated the pattern, more or less, but in a more deliberate way, using the advantage of abundant, cheap labor. India is now furiously paddling to catch up. It is 60 years later, but we have the advantages of history and hindsight, an engaged government, democratically elected, and a vibrant private sector. We could thoughtfully craft something like a national policy. That is the topic of this lecture. Which brings me to the last W of my intro to Raghu. Why should we trust him? The word polycrisis describes multiple crises that overlap and are interconnected. Even if we don't wish to label them crises, things in India are not quite as sanguine as they might seem. Sure, we are seeing per capita growth, and we have impressive infrastructural development, widespread penetration of the digital economy. But there are 40 million unemployed, maybe 70 million. Female participation rates are single digit or in the low 20s, whatever, miserably low. Worryingly, average consumption trends are not reflecting in income growth. Inequality of income and wealth have worsened. The top 10 polluted cities in the world are in India. The Himalayan glaciers are melting and the Maldives sinking. And as many as 5 million, not the official 500K, people may have died during the COVID pandemic. We are certainly not prepared for the next one. And finally, democratic freedoms and constitutional rights are seriously threatened. To analyze and address a polycritical situation, what does not work is siloed expertise and a facile interdisciplinary inclusion of cross effects. What is required is consilience, a true synthesis of knowledge from different fields, and agreement regarding underlying principles. Such sophisticated reworking of structure and dynamics will unsurprisingly contradict some hitherto hallowed results. Striking a bond pose, Raghu has famously said, "I do what I do." And as I was reading stuff written by and about Raghu, I was struck by how much sense he makes and how right he turns out to be, even when he goes against the grain, which is often. Prescient is a word I kept running into. I believe that within his academic self, Raghu has integrated the myriad specializations of his field such that many twains, east, west, macro, micro, positive, normative, history, theory, all meet in him. Even at the gross macro-micro level, the arena he plays in is clearly macro action, but he is loyal to the fundamental theorems of microeconomics. In theory, perfectly competitive markets should ensure efficiency and in theory, they do ensure efficiency and should thus determine basic economic transactions. But the world is full of market failures, such as monopolies, and importantly, free, unregulated markets do not guarantee equity. But thoughtful and informed intervention is key. Raghu is the rare omni-economist with administrative chops, but with deep expertise in each field, no Jack. This intimacy with all manner of economic theories and realities, understanding of economic history, and fingertip command over data is what makes him, I think, so good at what he does. Or maybe it is just the goddess whispering in his ear. After all, he does still hold his Indian passport. Breaking the mold is a masterful blueprint, a carefully constructed edifice of reasoning and policy prescriptions. Not only do Raghu and his co-author Rohit Lamba plot out the broad outlines of their plan, they also suggest the inclusive economic and political institutions that will enable and encourage the population to produce and save, invest, and innovate. Importantly, this includes developing the capabilities of its people, a term and an approach associated with my Professor Sen that I mentioned earlier, developed for his writings on justice and ethics, and applied by Raghu brilliantly for their important pragmatic implications. Larry Summers was wrong. Raghu's no Luddite, and we should celebrate that. I hope Kristen has a martini waiting for him, stirred, not shaken. Welcome, Raghu.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much, Chancellor, Vice Chancellor Anu, Tom, and Mr. Luther, and all the distinguished guests here, including my long-lost cousin. I lost her again, but I'll find her, Padma. Thanks for that wonderful introduction. I want to say, like ChatGPT Plus, there was a little bit of hallucination in there, but not a whole lot. So the nice parts were the hallucination. I'll take that. I wish I could take you for every introduction. That was a very kind introduction. What do I want to talk about? I want to talk a little bit about this book that I wrote with Rohit Lamba, which you see here. But really, I want to talk about India's future. And, we're a proud country. And we should be proud. We have achieved a lot. We've grown at 6% for the last 30, 35 years. That's an extraordinary feat, only dwarfed by perhaps China, maybe South Korea, but very few countries on the same page. And so what's to worry? Well, what's to worry is we didn't grow at the same time as they did. And the world has changed. The world is a very different world, and it's changing in front of our eyes. The last 1.5 months have brought so much change relative to the world we had before. And the question is, given how much further we have to go as a country, given that even today at $2,500, $2,700 per capita, the numbers are always a little fuzzy. We still have to multiply that 5 times to become a middle-income country, and to multiply that, 15 times to become a middle-rich country. That's a long way to go. And the question is, can we get there before we grow old? because we're not a country with a lot of immigration. We already see in our southern states, the fertility rate has fallen below reproduction rates. And that means the southern states are already at this point seeing aging slowly happen. For the rest of the country, we probably see the end of our demographic dividend, which is where the dependency ratio keeps falling. That is the number of very old and very young people to the rest of the population. That's the dependency ratio. When that is really high, you don't have a lot of workers. And so you don't grow very fast. When that is falling, you're doing reasonably well. That's when every East Asian country really grew fast. That's where we are today. But our growth rate hasn't really picked up at this point. 6 is what we've been doing for a long time. We should be doing 8, 9, if we actually want to get where our Prime Minister wants to take us, be a developed country by 2047. And so the question really is, what can we do? And part of the concern is the world that South Korea, that China faced when they were at our stage of growth is not the world that we face today. And I'll come to reasons why. And so that tells us we need a new model of growth. We can't sort of say they did it, therefore we'll follow that and we'll do it. It doesn't work that way. The world has changed. And so what we have to recognize is, given the world has changed, what are the possibilities for us escaping? So this is a chart of Indian growth since about 2016. And what you can see is, we were doing pretty much what we've done for 30 years before that, for 25 years, since about our liberalization in the early 1990s, grown around 6%. Then we had the pandemic, we came down. But as you can see, we've gone back to the 6% growth, not made up to a full extent what happened in the pandemic, but we're still growing around 6. And the question is, can we add those percentage points, which will make us much faster? And to answer that, I have to first tell you what the standard path of growth was, the East Asian path. And this has been perhaps the most successful path of growth in the history of the world. Because these countries, starting with Japan, going to Korea, Taiwan, Malaysia, and moving on to China, grew faster than pretty much every country in the world, with the exception of Europe in the 50s when it was recovering from the destruction of World War II. But when you look at the growth of the US itself, it grew slowly but steadily for almost 100 years. That's why it's so rich. But the pace of growth, the annual growth, was much slower than what you saw China do or South Korea do. And so what made that path really successful? Most of it was catch-up growth. You knew what other rich countries had done, and you were trying to follow them, mimic their path. But first, to do that, you had to generate surpluses. And they did that through agricultural reform. They generated agricultural surpluses. Farmers were getting richer. And farmers could invest back in agriculture. Productivity increased. You didn't need so many people. So people left agriculture, and there was more money to invest outside agriculture. Where did you invest it in? Industry. The problem, of course, with industry is that typically manufacturing requires scale. The more scale you have, the more efficient you become at manufacturing. When you're manufacturing for a small, poor country, there's not much demand. Let me give an example for some of the younger people in this room. Take top hats. What demand is there for top hats in a poor country? Very little. But if you're manufacturing top hats for the United States, or better still, the United Kingdom, there's substantial demand. So you get scale through exports. You get efficiency through exports. And so what many of these countries did was export-led manufacturing growth. 4 words, but that was their strategy. Let us invest in manufacturing. We get a lot of low-skilled people into manufacturing. Because their labor is cheap relative to the labor in industrial countries, somebody in the UK manufacturing top hats, the cost of labor is huge. Manufacture it in Japan, you can do it when Japan was poor, you can do it at a fraction of the cost. So make it, sell it, and reinvest the surpluses you get from those profits back in better capital equipment, but also in people, better education. So your people get more skilled, your capital equipment gets better, you move up the production scale. From just assembling stuff, soldering stuff onto motherboards, you move on to actually making the components that go onto the motherboard, which is a much more sophisticated task. You make the chips, the transistors, et cetera, and you move up the value chain. Eventually, you run out of manufacturing. You're really very productive in manufacturing. You've serviced all the demand you can. More people now leave manufacturing into services. So start with agriculture, move into manufacturing, eventually move into services. That was the path. Now, India missed the bus. India actually never developed manufacturing to a large extent. If you look at Indian manufacturing employment as a share of total employment, it has stayed relatively fixed since the 1980s. With all the talk about manufacturing in the last 10 years, we haven't moved that needle. It still stayed around 10-12%. So what happened? Why did China catch the manufacturing bus in the early 1980s when it liberalized? India certainly did more manufacturing after liberalization in value-added terms, but never became a manufacturing giant. Why did that happen? Well, China was different in a number of ways from India, and it's important to recognize that some of the elements of Chinese success have to do with ways it was actually somewhat stronger, when it started liberalization. Both countries were about the same in terms of per capita GDP in the 60s and maybe even into the 70s. They were both very poor. But China had emphasized education. Maybe makes it easier for everyone to read Mao's Red Book. But for whatever reason, they emphasized education. India, democracy didn't. And that's a big failure. Anu talked about Amartya Sen and capabilities. Absolutely. He put his finger on what was missing. We simply did not equip our people with capabilities, maybe because we didn't think that they needed it. Agriculture is employing everyone. Why educate people? They may be educated beyond their status. Why actually do it? For whatever reason, as a democracy, our biggest failure was we didn't educate our people. When we started educating was only seriously educating after liberalization in the early 90s, when you saw the years of education in India move up. But till then, we were very, very lackadaisical about it. China wasn't. So when China liberalized, there were a lot of young, trained people able to go into the factories, serve as the workforce for factories. More important, they were numerate and literate, so they could open their own businesses. And so you had a lot of small businesses opening up and a huge wave of growth that took place starting in the early 80s. India didn't have that. It had, moderately educated workers, a narrow set of such workers. Yes, we had some manufacturing revival in the early 90s, especially with the end of the license permit Raj, but it never took off at the scale that China did. A second important factor in China, when you look at China's business environment, look at the doing business reports about India. That's a World Bank index of how easy it's to do business. China was always middling in those. Somewhere in between Mongolia and pick another country. It wasn't high. it was not a great environment to do business. India was approximately there. And so why did China do so much better? Isn't the ease of doing business important? It is. But what China figured out was a way to bend the rules for the entrepreneurs. And the way it did this was through decentralization. Every local sort of mayor had an incentive to increase growth because higher growth in the local area gave him sort of, a stronger probability of promotion up the hierarchy. And so he was incentivized, typically he was incentivized, but also he was empowered because the mayor could actually set the rules for businesses locally. So you hear these stories from Indian business people. I went to thus and such city in China, and the deputy mayor met me at the airport, took me to the mayoral office where the mayor was there to greet me, and all the documents were on the table, and they said, sign on the dotted line, and you don't need to do this, this, this. Those are just regulations. You can ignore them. Here are the things you really need to do. And I set up and I got started. That's a story we've all heard. Many of us in India have heard that story. It's true, because the local administration was much more incentivized to help business. And there was a little bit, I scratch your back, you scratch mine. There was some corruption. But it also was important for local growth. And so China did this decentralization and tailored the local rules to business. India didn't. Now, China stopped doing this. The anti-corruption drive, etc., has made many local governments very wary about bending the rules and being held up by the central government. But this used to be the practice. Now, what prevented this from becoming corruption, which actually often slows growth, as we've seen in a number of countries across the world? What prevented it from being crony capitalism, which is a headwind to growth, is it was also competitive. Because Shanghai competed with Beijing, and Beijing competed with a province in the south. They were all sort of focusing on their local champions, but it was, in a sense, competitive cronyism. We support our guys, but we have to fight the battle. We cannot just protect them and have a protectionist shield around the entire sort of local champion. So competitive cronyism helped China immensely. China also suppressed market and democratic forces. Let's not be shy about saying that. China often paid its households much lower interest rates than what might be considered market interest rates. Why? Because they wanted household savings to be sent cheaply to corporations. And the corporations then got money at a low rate, could invest, and could build those fantastic factories, and the government could build out infrastructure. Moreover, China didn't pay high wages. Even though productivity rates went up, they didn't pay their workers based on their productivity. Chinese unions were under the control of the government. This would never happen in India. Unions were much more aggressive, and the middle class would not accept wages being kept low. But also, or interest rates being kept low. But also China kept its exchange rate low in order to give its industries a competitive advantage. All of this hurt the Chinese household. The Chinese household could not consume as much. I mean, if your exchange rate is low, you can't buy anything abroad because it's too costly. Similarly, if you're not paid a high interest rate, you don't get income. If your wages don't go up, you can't buy as much as you could if your wages went up much faster based on productivity. So the Chinese household was suppressed in favor of Chinese production. This created an enormous production machine. But you see the consequences today. Chinese consumption is still really low. And the Chinese household is essentially not able to, essentially absorb the production that China has, which is why China runs $1 trillion trade surplus. But India did none of these. And so India was playing by the rules of the game, And as a result, it missed the manufacturing bus. So when you look at India, that green line that I showed, that I have on this graph, is a fraction of workers in industry. And you can see that's coming down at, the best you can say is it's not coming down fast. It's sort of flat. The orange line is employment in construction, which has been going up. This is the Indian success story in the last few years. Tremendous investment in construction, highways, roadways. Some of you have been to some of the new airports, not just Delhi, Mumbai, but some of the regional airports. That's all infrastructure. That's construction. That has been going up. Where India is not doing well recently is in service jobs. They have come down, but they were what actually were the source of employment for people leaving agriculture before that in the last, right till 2019. Last thing I want you to note is the blue line. That's agricultural employment. For every developing country, that should be on a steady path downwards because agriculture is not very productive, and agriculture, therefore, should be losing people to manufacturing, services, and construction. This should alarm every Indian who sees that, and in people outside also, because that's saying agricultural employment is going up. Why? Because we're not creating enough jobs outside of agriculture. So, first, let's take the services. Services growing, manufacturing, employment not. Danny Roderick calls this premature deindustrialization, okay? That you're deindustrializing before you've become industrialized. Now, I had a talk with Danny a couple of months ago, and he's come around to the view that, this is not entirely a bad thing. India is trying to find its new source of comparative advantage, which may not be manufacturing, but may in fact be services. I'll come to that in a second. What is alarming for India is low-quality agricultural job share is growing. In fact, the largest category here is women, self-employed, unpaid. That's the category that's growing in agricultural jobs. Is that a job or is it something else? That's what we need to ask. Unemployment is high, even though, our single biggest minority, women, are not working. We talked about the miserable labor force participation in your introduction. How does this, we don't collect good employment statistics. We could collect it once a year in the periodic labor force survey, but we don't have a regular employment number except there's a CMIE number, which was okay. But what you see is evidence that we don't create enough jobs by the number of people applying for government jobs. This goes through the roof. You have tens of millions applying for a few thousand jobs in the railways. These are PhDs, MBAs, engineers, all applying for jobs as clerks in the railway, a low-level job. You're seeing, if you see applications for the IAS, for the civil service exams, that's the top exam in India. It was the case in the early part of the century, they were going down. People actually saw the private sector as a place they wanted to go to, and applications for the IAS were going down. More recently, they've been zooming up. Today, they're about 6 times what they were in 2002, and our population hasn't grown 6 times. Why is government jobs so attractive? Because there aren't that many other jobs outside, especially created by the private sector. Now, even while all this is happening, if you look at the capital intensity of manufacturing, it's actually going up. We're making more through machines rather than through labor. And I would argue that part of that is really because technology is sweeping across the world and more manufacturing is becoming automated. So bottom line, this part of demographic dividend, we keep talking about, India is experiencing the demographic dividend, the dependency ratios coming down. Is that a dividend or is it a curse? If we can't provide jobs for all these young people, what do young unemployed people do? At some point, they get tired of their cell phones and their WhatsApps and so on, and they start getting anxious. We haven't reached that stage yet, but it's something that we should start worrying about. Okay, so which way should India go? Should we turn back the clock and jump onto the manufacturing bus? And if you want to categorize government policies over the last 10 years, this is the hope. Somehow we will re-energize manufacturing and all our people will get significant amounts of employment there. We can also step back and say, okay, what do we do for the future? And of course, what we choose determines how we use our resources. I'm not saying we need to pick a sector and say this is where we need to go. That's industrial policy. I don't think we have great success in industrial policy in India, picking sectors and seeing them win. Typically, as Gurcharan Das says, is the sectors that the government doesn't pay attention to that win. India grows at night. That's when the government is sleeping. But the government is essential to prepare the country for what is to come. And for that, it has to have a sense of what might be the needs of the future. So let's talk a little bit about that. Let's start with what's happening around us every day. First, as I said, automation is reducing jobs, even in low-skilled assembly. Go to a factory, a cell phone factory in Delhi, and you will see it's no longer workers in a row soldering stuff onto a motherboard. That used to be yesterday's job. Today, it's a machine soldering stuff onto a motherboard because you can't trust workers with the kind of precision that is required today. And it's a sequence of machines. Where do you need the unskilled worker? In sweeping the floor or in moving parts from one machine to another. And the factory I visited, the CEO said, we're going to automate that next year. We're going to have robots moving stuff from machine to machine. So even in unskilled assembly, it's narrowing. Yeah, there's still garments. Bangladesh does it. We could do it. We could do more. But really, when you look at electronic assembly and so on, doesn't create very many jobs. Furthermore, we're not competing with rich countries anymore. They've left that long back. They're uncompetitive. Despite what the current administration is trying to do, you're not going to create a lot of high school education worth jobs in the United States today. What you can do is bring back the jobs and have them done by machines. You'll need more sophisticated machines, but that is possible, but it's going to be costly. What India has is the problem that when it enters these areas, it's no longer competing with the US. So you don't have the advantage of having low-paid workers competing with high-paid workers. Remember the virtuous circle we talked about earlier? Instead, what you're doing is competing with Indonesia, Mexico, Vietnam, China, and robots. And they have brought down the profits in such manufacturing right down to the bone. It's as competitive as you can get. And of course, even while production is getting harder, the markets are getting smaller because more and more of the world wants to bring manufacturing back. Somehow, manufacturing fetishism is going across the world. And, is there really room for another China in this world? 1.4 billion people, are they going to get out of poverty through manufacturing? Unlikely. Even if climate change allowed us to manufacture so much, the competition and the protectionism would be problematic. So, when you look at the global supply chain and ask, okay, what does it look like today? Think of the iPhone's supply chain. There might be some Apple workers here, but look at the typical iPhone supply chain. On the x-axis is the stage in production. On the y-axis is the value added, how much value you get from that stage. In the early stages, when you're doing R&D design, very high value added. When Steve Jobs is putting together that iPhone design with all his clever people, that intellectual property is enormously valuable. Then you send the iPhone to Foxconn to manufacture. Apple hasn't really manufactured anything since 2004. Foxconn does it all, right? Or companies like Foxconn. The profits there are really very low. That's why it's at the bottom of the smile curve. This is called the smile curve. It's at the bottom of the smile curve because you don't have very much value added there. It's in assembly and production. And then you go back as you send the iPhone to an Apple store, the marketing, the advertising, the financing, and also the content, the app store that Apple has. All those are a big source of value added. So both at the beginning and the end, lots of value added, very little in the middle. Where should you want to be if you are looking at this kind of supply chain? In the middle or at the corners? Almost surely if you could pick, you want to be at the corners, right? But we're struggling to be in the middle. We are putting all our subsidies and et cetera, in trying to capture the lowest end of the supply chain. Does that make sense? Let me leave that as a question. Now, you might say this is only about low-skill manufacturing. What about the most sophisticated manufacturing? Making chips, right? TSMC runs the world's most sophisticated foundries. If you look at the supply chain for chips, it looks similar. Where is the value added? In an NVIDIA, a Qualcomm, a Broadcom. Those companies are hugely valued. Even though chip manufacturing is very sophisticated, TSMC is worth about 750 billion on a good day. NVIDIA on a good day is 4 trillion, right? Similarly, Foxconn on a good day is worth 50 billion. On a good day, Apple is worth 3 trillion. The multiplicative factor in design, services, intellectual property is much higher. Now, I'm not saying we have any Indian companies that match NVIDIA, but I'm saying if you want to be ambitious, do you want to be a Foxconn or do you want to be an Apple? Almost surely you want to be an Apple, not a Foxconn. Okay, the third element that I want to talk about is the growing promise of services. So not only are services more important in the supply chain, but interestingly, new technologies allow us to do services more easily. What we've seen after the pandemic is a huge increase in direct services. Today, a consultant can be in Bangalore and service somebody in Chicago because we learned how to do it from Seattle to Chicago during the pandemic. If it can be done from Seattle to Chicago, it can be done from Bangalore to Chicago. And so what you're seeing is many global consulting firms are saying, a lot of good people in India, a whole bunch of engineers being produced, a whole bunch of MBAs and so on. Why don't we recruit some of them directly? We can stay in India, so we don't have to pay them Western salaries, but we pay them a good salary and we get high quality people. That is where labor arbitrage is today. Remember I said the highly paid Western worker in the manufacturing versus the low-paid worker in manufacturing in East Asia. Today, it's the high-paid sort of service worker in the US versus the moderately paid service worker in India. Today, JP Morgan has 4,000 lawyers scrutinizing contracts across the world sitting in India. And you can multiply that. Every big global company has an India operation, what they call global capability centers, doing R&D, doing sometimes doing some of the front office functions, but certainly more than back office. It used to be back office, now it's a whole lot of front office stuff also. So you're seeing that services can be provided either directly, right? Unlike a haircut, which I can't provide at a distance and I can't scale up. Today's services can be provided at a distance and at scale. And it can be done as a link to manufacturing. So, what am I advocating after this sort of tour to Horizon? I'm not much of an interventionist, as you heard earlier from Anu. I don't think we have had great success with industrial policy in India. And I think the world's flirtation with industrial policy is going to end badly. We're going to see that you cannot sort of, subsidize chips to the extent you're doing and not see big disasters, big wastes of public money. So I'm not advocating privileging manufacturing or services, but I am saying this. We don't need to follow the old path of growth, low-skilled manufacturing exports. In fact, what we can emphasize in India is high-skilled services as an export area. And to some extent, we're already seeing it. In January, for the first time, Indian exports of services exceeded Indian manufacturing exports. So our fastest growing area for exports is in fact services, despite all that government is doing to expand manufacturing exports. More important, every dollar of service exports has a huge amount of domestic value added. While every dollar of manufacturing exports typically involves importing most of the components, putting them together, and selling them back abroad. We pride ourselves on the tremendous expansion in mobile phone exports. But most of those exports consist of components which were imported first. And so in terms of value added, services is much bigger. Now, I'm saying this is a possibility. I'm not saying we should insist on it and say we must do services at the expense of manufacturing. But what I'm saying is you don't need to fixate on only low-skilled manufacturing. There are other ways to grow. Now, what I would say is let those high-skilled, whether manufacturing or services, be our leading edge. And that's not going to create jobs. How many well-qualified consultants or engineers can you have in India? But that can be the source of foreign exchange earnings. That can be the source by which you bring money into India in a number of ways. Where you're going to create jobs, almost surely, is going to be elsewhere, because we don't have so many highly skilled people. If we focus on moderate skilling and skilling for the kinds of jobs there are in India, we can create a lot more employment. Some of you who live in India, how easy is it to find a plumber in Delhi, a good plumber? How easy is it to find a good carpenter? It's hard because we haven't trained people in those kinds of services. We have a lot of, BAs, BScs, who are virtually unemployable because they're not good enough to do the high-skilled jobs, but they really don't want to do the jobs that require working with the hands, and they're not trained for it. They don't know how to deal with a modern EV and how to repair it. But if we did some changes and did some upgradation of the skills in our workforce, there's so many jobs we could fill. So a lot of states are looking at skilling up their workforce. We still haven't found how to do it effectively, but we're learning. And for example, Tamil Nadu has a scheme called Nan Mudalvan, and that's sort of, we have to test to see whether it's effective, but it's one attempt. This is not to say abandon manufacturing. It's saying give everything else a chance, but focus on what governments can do best, which is the capability building better skills in the workforce, building stronger education, better healthcare. And then see what happens. Because as we have more capable workers, the world will come looking for them. And almost surely, services are going to be a big part of where we actually grow. In all this, I would say, by all means, let's talk about becoming a developed country by 2047. But before getting delusions of grandeur, let us also recognize that 35% of our kids suffer from malnutrition. And 20 years from now, that's going to be 35% of the workforce. 35% of the workforce which doesn't have full cognitive capabilities because of malnutrition is not a developed country. So to become a Viksit Desh by 2047, we need to focus on the problems today. And that means dealing with these. It's more boring, it's more exciting to talk about being a developed country, but we need to fix some of these real-life issues today. So we need to work at every dimension. Malnutrition on this end. Our good universities, I mean, I know most of you must, or people of Indian origin here, must have come from one of the stellar universities we have. They were stellar, but they're not keeping pace with the kinds of universities we have in the rest of the world, where intellectual property is being produced at a huge rate. We need to have universities that are in the top 100. We don't have one. We need many more in order to produce the intellectual property, in order to produce the products, which are then going to be the way we grow even faster. And so we need to invest in those universities. So much work to do. This is just showing you how services have grown. India's share of services in global exports is crossing 4.5. Its share of manufacturing, like the jobs, is stagnant. Let me give you two stories, because I know some of you are not dyed-in-the-wool economists, so I'm going to just give you a couple of stories. Lenskart. This is an example of a firm started by a very young guy who went back to India, tried to figure out what he wants to do. Many of these entrepreneurs want to change the world. They want to do stuff that moves the needle. And this guy said, one of the things that can change the world is to improve, vision. Many Indians sort of, you see them, over time, they bring the book closer and closer to their face because they can't read at a distance. Their eyes are deteriorating. And he says, most of them don't even go for checkups. How do I bring the checkup to them? How do I bring eyeglasses more easily to them? So he starts this firm, Lenskart. What that shop has is just a fraction of the models he has available. Because he wants you to pick the model that you like. He wants you to try it out in the store. But then, after checking your vision, finding out what exactly you need, he goes, produces it in his factory in Gurgaon in 2 days. And then he gets it back to you. So quick service, that's a part of much of Indian enterprise today. How do I get quick service? But also manufacturing. He says, if I had to manufacture the commodity spectacle, I would go to China. They're much cheaper. They would beat the Indian manufacturing any day. If I want to manufacture the specialized spectacle in small quantities and for specific customers quickly, I have to do it in India. So when I combine the service of testing and selling, etc., with the manufacturing, I have a product which can stand up to the Chinese competition. And he's selling a lot of spectacles nowadays. The second is a company called Orchids. And you might wonder what that is. It's actually a company that runs a bunch of schools and also creates content for schools. One of the big problems in India is not the quantity of education, it's the quality of education. We have all our kids in school, except they're not learning, so by 5th grade they're dropping out. What we need is higher quality education across the board. Now, how do you create a Phillips Academy, Andover, or Exeter, or a Cathedral John Connon in Mumbai? How do you create that quickly and in large quantities? Very hard, because they've been based on, good teachers over time, reputation building, culture building, etc., etc. So how do you multiply that number? What this guy did was he said, okay, let's figure out what it takes to get good teaching. We're going to create 35,000 lesson plans. For each class, in each subject, we're going to create a lesson plan. Talk about the French Revolution. In the first 5 minutes, we talk about what led it up to it, the growing anxiety in the peasant class, etc., the 3 estates. Then we have a 15-minute debate in class about this issue. Then we show this video, and then we have a pop quiz, and then we end the class. That lesson plan goes to each teacher who's supposed to teach that lesson 2 days before the lesson. And they figure out how to teach it. But it's, as some of you teachers here know, a lot of teaching is about logistics. Getting it right, getting the timing right, getting the structure of the lesson right. These guys are handed the structure of the lesson. I would hate to teach in such a school. I mean, I like to go on and on my own trip. But what it does is it makes an average teacher a good teacher. Not a great teacher, but think about your school. If all your teachers were good teachers, it would be a great school because you've got a lot of indifferent teachers within even the really good schools. And so what this guy has done is what is called scripted learning. By that, he's trying to raise the quality of education. There's so much entrepreneurship in India of this kind, but both these are trying to benefit from services in India and expanding it much more in ways. But the first is linking services and manufacturing. The second is actually services in order to improve the quality of the services India provides to the rest of the world. Enormous scope for jobs if we just focus on what needs to be done. Finally, and last couple of slides, what can government do? I would say a couple of things. One is decentralize government more. The state of Uttar Pradesh has 240 million people, all governed from Lucknow. That's, 2/3 the size of the United States. The United States has 50 states, maybe a 51st on its way. I didn't mean that seriously. 50 states, and within each state, various cities, mayors, etc. Look at the extent of decentralization. Lots of local government officials. Where India is very weak is local government. Not too many. Because they don't have the powers. They don't what is called funds, functions, functionaries. They don't have the funds. They don't have the functions, the powers, and they don't have people, the functionaries. We need to go that way if we really need to make a dent, including in simple things like better schools. The one state that has focused on better schools is Delhi, because it's really a large municipality. Some of the southern states, which are more decentralized, have focused on better schools. Why? Because when you are in a centralized state, it's much harder for you to show results on schooling. When you are a local government authority, people can see how your schools are functioning. Do the teachers show up on time? Are the schools painted? And you can show first performance improvement, and you can get rewarded for it in the election. So decentralization will make us focus much more on improving public services like schooling and healthcare. Second is budgets. We always say we're a poor country, but we're a middling country right now with a total GDP approaching 4 trillion. So we need to figure out how to spend our budget well. And what we have to recognize in investing in our people is probably job one. Again, back to sense capabilities. We waste our money in many ways. But prestige projects is one of the places we've wasted a lot of money. Now, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say in this hotbed of technology, I think building a chip foundry in India is a waste of money. It's a waste of money because it's enormously expensive. Someday we will build chip foundries. But today, building a chip foundry neither gets us the necessary capabilities, jobs, or even security. Some people say we need chips for security. No, you're dependent on the whole supply chain which exists outside your country. There's no way that just doing that last bit in your country is going to get you any security unless you bring the whole supply chain in. And that's even more expensive than just building the foundry. I would say rather than build chip foundries, let's build universities. New universities, which actually can create chip designers, of which we have a lot. Qualcomm employs a lot in India. Broadcom employs. Maybe we have an Indian chip design firm, which does its own and sort of competes. Maybe there's Indian AI. I talked to some entrepreneurs who are talking about Indian AI. But that's what we need, and for that we need high quality Indian graduates. Build universities, don't build chip factories. One chip factory can build 10 strong universities. That trade-off to me seems wholly weighted towards universities. Why do we need the Olympics? We have a bunch of industrialists pushing for the Olympics today. It's one of the bigger time and money sinks. Time because a lot of government attention goes into it, and money sinks because you build a lot of infrastructure which doesn't get used after that. Look at China, one of the most successful Olympics in Beijing, but that bird's nest stadium lies largely unused. Or Jawaharlal Nehru Stadium in Delhi, built for the Asian Games, largely unused. I've been there when there's the rare event. You got to dust off the seat because there's a layer of dust so thick. So why do that? That's an example of we need to pay attention to our biggest deficiency, that our human capital, our biggest potential asset, is not where it should be. And that should be our investment. Lastly, I would say, given the centralization, we do much more in cash transfers today. This is the name of the game. It's also called freebies in India. Cash transfers which are targeted at the very poor are generally a good thing, gives them more money to spend on what they need, gives them more power, and gives them more status, especially when it goes into the woman's bank account. But broad-based cash transfers, which is now the sort of competition amongst political parties, I think just inhibits your ability to do the kinds of public investment I'm talking about. So that's something, again, that we need to think about. And lastly, democracy. Do we need democracy? I, could be persuaded that democracy held us back during the phase of industrialization. But I'm not there, because everybody, when they talk about democracy, or everybody, when they talk about authoritarian governments, has in mind Singapore under Lee Kuan Yew. They don't remember, Mobutu Sese Seko in Africa. They always want the good guys, never the bad guys. But in an authoritarian regime, you could end up with either. And that's why authoritarian regimes are much more volatile than democracies. At least in democracies, you can throw the rascals out. In democracy, I think there's much more value today than perhaps in the past. Because we are charting a course which nobody really has done before us. There's no East Asian path for us. We need to know how to do it. And that means we need to understand where we're going wrong. If we don't get feedback from the press, from critics, from academics, we'll go off track a long distance before we know it. And I think we're in danger of doing that. So democracy, to my mind, is really very useful. It also allows bottom-up protest. When the local services are bad, you want locals to be able to protest, not be arrested and sent to jail. That, again, requires strong democracy. Of course, academic studies show democracy fosters creativity, debate, innovation, partly because authoritarianism essentially seeps from politics into academia. The hierarchy becomes attuned to the needs of the government, and that doesn't allow a lot of space for free thinking. Yes, you can produce a military-industrial complex with that, but it's going to be largely military, not so much creative industry, especially aimed at consumers. Lastly, in this day and age, when you're trying to export services, democracy helps, because you're going to say, my government doesn't spy on your citizens when I sell you services. My government respects privacy. It does actually have checks on the government. That's a great selling point, if we can sell it. And that means strengthening our democracy. So let me end by saying, much to do. We can create an India way by building on our strengths. And those strengths are obvious if you look around. We have a burgeoning services industry. We have a strong history of good education. Let's build on all that. Our doctors are respected across the world. Why don't we use more of them, create more of them for our own population? Now, this could be a model for many countries that are looking for a growth model in this world where manufacturing is becoming more difficult. Africa, South Asia, South America, lots of places that will embrace an Indian way if we can show that it exists. And this means focusing on the ideas of the future, taking inspiration from our past. Let's not lose our past. It's a glorious past in some ways. But let's not dwell in it. Let's not just say we were great in 2000 years ago, and that's what we should aspire to. That's the past. Let's leave it behind and look for the future. That's where we will really be competitive. Let me stop there. Thank you.
What do you read in your colors?
No, you mean saffron? Saffron is in our flag. And green. Yeah. This is part of our flag also.
Yes, but why is it in the south?
Good question. I didn't, you're a deeper thinker than I am. I just picked this up and yeah.
I think we have time for questions, but I think there's a mic that's, so if you will pick on someone and then, okay.
Gentleman there.
Sorry. Excellent presentation. I'm also from IIT, but a lot senior than you are. 1973 from IIT Kanpur. And I've been in the field of computing for last 52 years, right? I've worked at Hewlett-Packard and Sun Microsystems and SAP and startups. So I think you are missing one very important thread here. We have been, as an alumni of IIT Kanpur or any other IIT, we have created Pan IIT, and I lead the IIT Kanpur initiatives. We are working with our institutes to upscale their skills in the academic world. We started a foundation for IIT Kanpur. We have given $44 million, have connected them to UCSC, and trying to create those classes of education so that this university benefits as well as IITK invests. But I think in India has reached a point where through IITs we can create new innovative products just like we have done it. I have been part of it, which has created billions of dollars of these things. And I think you should pay attention to that and let India create innovative products for its own economy rather than servicing the Western world. Because that's what is needed to uplift the society.
You can do both. You don't need to focus on one.
You can do both.
What is interesting in what you said is really the support, which I think is good. But also what is interesting is we don't have a 1,000 Talents program. We don't actually bring back the successful people across the world back to India.
You don't need it anymore.
You do need it.
No, let me tell you why. I created Sun Microsystems engineering centers in Bangalore as well as in Ahmedabad. These days, using virtual tools, you can do innovation wherever you are sitting there, so long as you export the methodology, which is what we are trying to do through the IITs. Yeah. We have the information, but we have to stay plugged into the US system also so that we don't lose it.
Maybe, but what you need is also people to commit there to be able to innovate there. I ran a firm, I ran a business, not a business, I ran a whole organization there. My problem was I didn't have enough economists worth the salt. The homegrown people were not good enough. Yeah, and what I needed was people to come back to help with them because the young were very willing to learn. But there weren't people they could learn from.
I think
and at a distance. Yeah, no, absolutely. But you're trying to, what I hear you saying is you don't need that.
No, I'm not saying that you don't need it. But I think once you create those new innovative products, it will spread like a wildfire, just like in the US. I came to the Silicon Valley in '77. Yeah. And I've seen its economy grow by $3 to $5 trillion now.
No, you're right, exactly right. But what I'm trying to say is this. We need to value our diaspora also and bring as many of them as we can back so that they can actually spread their thinking. You're saying it can be done at a distance, only to an extent. You actually need the values and the capabilities to be brought there to actually move India also forward. And that's not happening.
Lots of hands. Arun,
A fantastic talk, Raghu. Very nice to see. In some ways, it was a little simplistic. I think you spoke about manufacturing and services. One thing you did not talk about, which we spoke about earlier, was artificial intelligence or AI, and how you think there can be a big impact. In a way, you could call it services. Ideally, call it products, right? That's the sort of Silicon Valley product mentality where you're building out new products, companies, industries, categories of industries now with AI. Whether it's agentic AI, whether it's infrastructure using NVIDIA chips. It doesn't have to be manufacturing in the traditional way that you were talking about, right? But the hyperscalers, where GPU clouds, where you can now enable a brand new growth story in India. And then again, after that, worldwide. And of course, people here, you see this room, everybody's experts in technology. So I was just wondering, do you want to talk about how technology can be helpful in building products for the world?
I think it can. I think just pushing our discussion earlier, there is a real question on how you take maximum advantage of AI, right? And there's a question of where AI will displace, where AI will aid, and where AI will create new jobs, right? So there are new jobs. AI prompter wasn't a job earlier. But it'll also displace. I talked with a finance company CEO in India who said he has 6,000 customer service reps. And he says, next year they're all gone, for the most part, because I can replace them with AI, which does a better job on 3 dimensions. It collects data in real time while the call is going on. Second, it's actually better because it's based on so many more case studies. And third, it speaks 7 Indian languages. So this is worrisome because it means actually even those middle income jobs that people have struggled on to, there will be some displacement. Which means the answer is we do need to focus on also upgrading so that people can use AI rather than be displaced by AI. And that's a huge job. That requires, again, a lot more IITs. We have 23, 24 IITs. We need 100 for the...
I would like to share a couple of experiences that I had. I'm an old man, so these things happened a long time back. So in around 1968, one of the Indian companies hired 5 of us from US universities to start working on computers. They were rich, they had plenty of money. They thought that computers are happening, we should be in it. Well, we got there, and after a very short time, we concluded that that's not a good idea. What we should do is what you said, build some applications in India. New applications that we build, and through that we learn how these applications work. That company today, I think, hires about 500,000 people in providing service. Very interesting. Another experience I have, which is not the same, one of the sponsors of this lecture series is a guy named Arjun Malhotra. He and I talked about whether I could be of any help, and he and his friends enabled me to go to one of the IITs and encourage them to focus on an application. So instead of theoretical studies only, focus on an application. The students who work there are in leading positions, unfortunately, in the United States. But it worked because the school was there. They were not focusing on applications, which is necessary to learn techniques that are marketable today.
Sir, I'll ask, yeah. Well, it's great to speak after Bijoy. Great to speak after Bijoy, who's been a quiet inspiration to lots of people in the Valley. My question is on a bit different topic. When we came in, the theme was presented as navigating between protectionism and automation. I'd love to hear what you think about protectionism, the way it's going around the world.
I think protectionism is in some ways a reaction to automation, right? That what you're seeing across the industrial world is middle-income jobs for the moderately educated have disappeared. They disappeared, most economists would say 4:1, 4 for automation, 1 for trade. They did disappear to China, but they also disappeared because machines replaced people, right? And so I think the angst in many developed countries is about those middle-income jobs. Oh, when we were young, we could get a job with a high school education. Today, our kids can't. And even with a college education, it's sometimes getting tougher unless it's STEM jobs. It's a STEM education. So I think there's an attempt to go back to the past, saying that somehow if we bring back manufacturing, all those middle-income jobs, especially for males, will come back, and we will be able to re-employ a lot of those people who are, angry, whether it's in Germany or in France, or in the United States. I think it's wishful thinking. I think what you bring back, if you bring back the jobs, or if you bring back the production, is work done by machines. To compete with the rest of the world, given the high cost of labor in the US, it's going to be much more automated than elsewhere. So I think we'll go through the burst of protectionism. I'm not talking about what happens every day in Washington today. I'm talking about the general trend towards raising tariffs in order to protect jobs. I think there will be a surge. I think we'll discover that it doesn't do what we need it to do. I don't know what happens after that. Do you bring it down? I worry very much when I see this country sort of keeping out EVs, the industry of the future, that, if you keep it out for long enough, if you don't have a terminal date on that, it becomes a crutch. As we saw in India with the license permit Raj, eventually you're so outdated that you absolutely don't want to bring down the tariff barrier. And we know that BYD now makes really good cars, but it's not allowed to sell any in the US. How long before the US falls behind on that frontier technology? Pick any industry. Steel. How many times have we protected steel in this country? And is it still anywhere near competitive? No, it's sort of, there's a fetish that it needs to be protected. So my worry is we're losing what makes this country really strong, which is innovation, competition, and technology, which many of you contribute to.
Dr. Rajan, here.
Hi. Hey, y'all. I'm Kanishka. Thank you so much for this talk. My question, it touches a little bit on what we just talked about there, but basically, if at the risk of being reductive, it sounded like your solutions are feed people, educate people, decentralized government, and I think we can all agree that those are great solutions, simple and elegant solutions, but to kind of make a parallel to the US, where we're seeing us, gutting education, gutting a lot of those types of programs, and I think similarly to what you're saying in India, where you're focusing on prestige products like foundries, which we're doing here as well. Well, essentially, we're seeing a backslide from a lot of these solutions that we should be focusing on, both in India, but also here in the West, right? And I'm wondering if we can't even do it right here, like what are some of the ways we can actually implement these solutions? If anything, it seems like across the world, we're moving in the opposite direction.
Yeah. Look, I'm less certain that building a foundry in the US is a bad idea, because you do get some security in this country because you can bring the rest of the supply chain nearby, if not in the country. Yes, you may still buy machines from ASML, but hopefully, Europe and the US will not drift apart too much, despite what's happening now. But for India, it's a bigger stretch. And so long as India has a few friends in Korea, in Europe, you can still buy chips. Remember, and this is something very important, we're not talking about fighting World War II for 5 years. We're talking about a 2-week war or a 3-week war. That's the nature of wars nowadays, right? Again, if it comes to something bigger, there's a whole lot else that has to change. But short wars, your chip sort of supply chain is not going to be that effective in that time. Having buffer stocks of chips, if you need to produce drones in a massive quantity quickly and things like that might be more useful. And a lot of that can be built also through smuggling from various countries in the world. How has Russia maintained its defense industry despite not having a chip manufacturer? Because it smuggles it from everywhere else in the world. So that's an aside. I think it's important to have a vision. Where are you going? And I would say the fundamental point of what we're trying to say is, forget everything else you're doing, focus on human capital. Everything else follows. And this is the fundamental tension, if you want, between Bhagwati and Sen, right? With Sen taking the side of human capital. I think Sen had it right, at least for today's world. If we don't develop our human capital, we don't have a chance. And so, let's start thinking about what changes we need to make. Will decentralization happen? No, we're going the opposite way. We're centralizing more and more. But with at least a vision out there, maybe more voices can be raised to try and effect that vision.
Dr. Rajan, your human capital question is going to face a very big tsunami that our world, the Silicon Valley world, is throwing at us at a massive pace right now, is the notion of ultralight companies and ultralight products. There's a company called Midjourney that has 11 people and does 200 million annual recurring revenue, which is unheard of level of productivity per engineer. And this trend is going to burst at an enormous pace right now. Now, India's success has been in big numbers of people working in tech. That phenomenon is going to change. How do you foresee India dealing with
Does
this?
your company do plumbing? Can it take care of bad plumbing?
No, I think that's a great point, actually. You can't find a good plumber in Silicon Valley either.
Yeah. So let's separate this into two issues. Can we produce companies, 11 people companies that
in India?
In India.
Yes.
And that's what we heard earlier. We can do it. And I think we should do more of those.
Yes, I agree.
For sure. And there are stories.
Will not employ that huge population.
It will not. That's why we need two solutions. It's not the same solution.
Right.
You need to cater to the growing need for public services in India. And that ranges from, plumbing, sanitation, street cleaning, to, education, professors as well as security guards. There's a lot of employment that can be generated in India.
So the education point is actually quite complicated. The plumbing education is more or less standardized. People can learn that skill and it's going to last them for a while. But if you look at, I'm a computer scientist from MIT. What I learned at MIT in 1995, there's absolutely not contemporary right now.
You're right.
There's absolutely nothing that I learned there that I can use right now.
You're absolutely right, which is true of my education also, right? But that's because I've forgotten what I learned. If I remembered it, maybe I could use it. But really, on your point, I think what we also need to recognize is we need continuing education.
Yes.
And that means, so what is actually interesting about India is there's a whole private sector which is willing to, give you that kind of education. So now lots of little shops giving you machine learning of indifferent quality. It's not great.
Self-learning. There's enormous self-learning.
There's self-learning, but there's also, you can pay for that kind of learning. It's not great quality. If we could improve the...
Great quality online learning available.
If you have the discipline. but not many people have that. No, what's the completion rate for these big multi-people courses? But what you're saying is very important. We have to become a learning society, which means change towards continuous education. That's very important. That's true of every country, but we need to do more of it.
Hi, thank you so much for the interesting talk, sir. Really appreciate it. I'm Soumya Ramakrishnan. I work for a non-profit. So I was just trying to, so we work with rural women, the tribals who are like getting their first livelihood. Like they have been in like distress migration and in construction sites and all of that stuff. And we are trying to get that. So I'm trying to figure out like, of course, education makes sense, service industry makes sense, but what do we do for these people right now when their current livelihood, and they're not a small number, right? There are a huge number. So for an immediate food security and food like livelihood, some level of livelihood, what are your thoughts around that?
Well, again, we need to work on every dimension, right? So for example, in rural villages, we have a lot of mothers who have been to high school. Not further, but they've been to high school. But they don't go out and work because there aren't necessarily, a lot of jobs outside agriculture. But we have creches in many areas, Anganwadis. Could we employ more mothers in Anganwadis? Get them to teach the young kid while the Anganwadi worker is working on the usual things that they have to do. And then can we then get them into the workforce once they've sort of practiced a little bit? So I was talking to a lady who works on bringing more women into the workforce. She says a lot of what is needed is get them to take the first step outside the home into the first job. So can we get them in? And then, hopefully they will figure out where else they can go. The bottom line I'm saying is not that there are easy solutions.
Yeah.
I'm saying there are lots of possible solutions if we start focusing on some of these issues. Some of it is government job creation, but that can't be the answer because government cannot create too many jobs. But can government sort of try and incentivize more apprenticeships? Right. Can it incentivize more skill building and make it work? We have a lot of skill building programs which don't work.
Of course.
So,
yeah. Thank you.
We'll take this side of the room now.
Okay.
I enjoyed hearing your views on so many things. One thing which particularly interests me is the quality of education, as you were saying. In the last 10 years, I have visited almost more than 50 universities in different parts of India, and I feel very depressed when I visit each one of them. I was in India a month ago or so, and I saw the new educational plan, some 62 pages, written beautifully. But in many respects, what they are proposing will take us backward and not really forward. They are more worried about the administration of the university, and they are worried about UGC playing a very important role in appointing vice chancellors. So instead of decentralizing it, they are really going back towards centralization. Curriculum is mostly past-oriented. There is hardly anything about future. You are a very, very influential person. Do speak about that instead of just saying that there are 240 million people in India and decentralization will be wonderful there. I come from UP, I understand what you are saying, but do say something about what is happening to education.
I've been trying to speak out, but you can speak and not be heard. That's how do you energize some of these debates? By the way, the new education policy, I thought was a good effort at trying to talk about what needs to be done on things like, merging some colleges so that you have a broader set of subjects and so on. There were some, very useful tactical steps that we need to do. But as you say, the big issue is how do we prepare Indians for the future, a future of AI and so on. And we don't say very much in those policies about that. I think the broader issue of quality is very important. How do we upgrade quality? The education policy talks a little bit about that, but that has to be the focus. I mean, I work with a university in the south. We didn't have a spectrometer for our scientists to do experiments. And they were desperate for one. We finally got a donor to give that spectrometer. But this is a well-supported university. There are lots of not so well-supported universities which have miserable labs and so on. How do we expect to do good science if we don't provide that? So at one end, we have to do that. At the other end, we have to be cutting edge on research. How do we combine both? And that's why we had this little debate about diaspora. I think we have a lot of people who have been educated to the frontiers here. We need to get more of them to come back. Being there makes a difference. And then change the kind of thinking in the labs, in the universities. There are very good people there, but can we work together to get to the frontier? That's really very important.
Hello, I've enjoyed your talk very much. Thank you. My name is Michael Hutchison, and I have two questions. One is, in China, special economic zones and encourage for export was predominant. And the special economic zones, of course, was a way to get around bureaucracy in China and the Communist Party. It's a state control. And if you look at Korea, it was different. Chaebols were huge, and it wasn't so much a specific product for export, but it was that you were exporting. So I understand in today's world with the more protectionist policies that these avenues might be limited, but India does have a huge internal market. So my question then is there room for encouraging these developments similar to China or Korea for the internal market in China? That's the first question. And the second is one of your main features of your talk was that there's lots of dimensions India can work on: education, malnutrition, and so forth, infrastructure. But if you have so many dimensions the government tries to do, are you just losing the focus of government policy? How much can you really focus on and expect to get done?
Yeah. On the first, I think we tried export promotion zones, and instead of focusing on deregulation and creating an environment which would be different for exports, it became a real estate play, which is what I sort of worried it would become, a way for developers to get a large chunk of land and then, make money off it, rather than really create an environment where you would have. But you're seeing some vestiges of that play out. There are export zones, for example, for services, which have where you can import some of the hardware and while you're exporting the software and without paying too much in tariffs and so on. I think that on the what can we do that looks like that, I think some of the states are competing with each other, which I think is good news. That they're competing to attract industry, they're competing to ease business, and you have, like the state of Tamil Nadu has a whole department called guidance, which is meant to encourage people to come and invest in Tamil Nadu. And so it sort of does that stuff that I said the mayors are doing in China. It tries to do that in some way. Here are the things that we're going to help you, so long as you're setting up a big enough plant in Tamil Nadu. So interestingly, Ford left Tamil Nadu and then has gone back in now, suggesting that its experience in leaving was not so bad that it didn't want to come back in. On your, pick which ones do you want to pick of all these? Look, governments have to do many things. They have to walk and chew gum at the same time. But if I had to pick one place which we are underemphasizing, it's a big one. It's the quality of our human capital. It's our biggest asset and the one that we need to invest far more in. Infrastructure was abysmal, is now okay. It's not great. it could be great. I mean, some places in India look fantastic in terms of the quality of the infrastructure, the Delhi-Agra highway, for example. We could do more of that. But where we really need to invest is in human capital, especially in some of the more backward states, because that's the inequality between states is something that is going to hold us back going forward. You see the tensions already in what is called the delimitation debate. The more populous northern states that have grown population faster now are looking for more seats in parliament relative to the southern states which didn't grow population fast because they developed and are richer. So the southern states are putting money into the central kitty and losing potentially seats in parliament. That's not a very, very stable political environment. You're already getting southern chief ministers sort of complaining in public about that. So these are examples of unequal growth. We need to fix that.
We have a few minutes. I hope we can take two questions. One, I know that Purva has a mic, and then maybe we'll be fair and take
whoever grabs the mic there.
Okay. And then there's already one.
So one of the underlying or main theme that I'm finding is the development of human capital. So increasing the per capita GDP, which is now probably 170th percentile, I think, in the world for the Indian per capita GDP. And one of the ways that you're suggesting is to not just have engineers and doctors and whatever else, but also have other skilled labor throughout the country. Am I correct in that? So with that, I just wanted to ask this audience, how many of your children would you like to have plumbers?
If that's what they can learn.
No, I'm just asking. Okay, maybe 3, right? 4. And my point this being, it's a big cultural change. Not just the government policy or anything else, but it's a big cultural change that has to happen. And that's where I agree with, not because I'm a Bengali, but Amartya Sen, that the cultural momentum has to happen, that it's okay to be a plumber. And maybe if the IITs offered a PhD in plumbing, people would become plumbers.
I think you're exactly right.
So
but what
your thoughts?
we're offering another solution. Make plumbing a subject in the IAS exam. Right? And you change the dialogue a little bit. At least those guys who are studying years have a skill at the end when they've superannuated from taking more exams.
Yeah, I know you mentioned before that a lot of India grew despite the government, right? And from what I've read, that's getting harder and harder to do, just because of the way the government is today, right? How do you see states, like you mentioned Delhi and the education, kind of becoming better. The party in power didn't get rewarded for that, right? So how do you see that playing out in the real world today?
Well, I mean, it's complex reasons why AAP didn't get re-elected. I'm happy to tell you some of what I believe happened. I don't think it was entirely that people were unhappy with their schools and their clinics. There's certainly the corruption scandal that they were enmeshed in. How much, since everybody has been released who was arrested, there still is a question of how much the law will be able to prove. But there are a whole bunch of issues, whether they were allowed to do any work with the lieutenant governor sort of breathing down their necks and so on. One can debate for a long time, but I think people were very, very happy with the quality of the school improvement. The fact that those government schools were actually better on some measures than the private schools. The teachers were happy. And the Mohalla clinics, to my mind, the local clinics that they created, were also quite welcome. Now, at some point, people also want more. Okay, this is yesterday's contribution. What have you done lately? And I think the government got too engaged in fighting with the center and at some point got detracted from spending more time on this. But I don't think that the public doesn't appreciate this. I think they don't get enough of it. And if they did, I mean, you look at the hunger for good education amongst our poor, and they're willing to skimp and save in order to send their kids to a better school. And so I would say that, people will be rewarded. They just don't talk about it. And that's the unfortunate part, with few exceptions. It's as I said, the conversation. I mean, again, somebody said simplistic. Obviously, in a 40-minute talk, you've got to be somewhat simplistic. But it is, for a variety of reasons, we are moving to an election system where you're trying to outpromise the other person on the goodies people will receive directly, because it's too hard and not credible that you will actually deliver on better public services. So nobody is promising better public services. Nobody is saying, here's how I'll change the schools, here's how I'll change healthcare. It's, I'm going to put 1,000 rupees in your account. And that's been also made more possible because of the developments in financial inclusion and so on. Everybody has an account, I can put 1,000 rupees in it. But that has detracted from politicians actually focusing on what people need, which is, for some it's the 1,000 rupees in their account, for many more it's a better school nearby.
Mr. Rajan, thank you so much. Sorry. Can I just... Okay.
So many hands going up, but it's what a lively. Would you like to take the last question?
Yeah, I think people would probably want to go eat or
I mean,
go
one
home.
observation.
Yeah.
I agree with all your points that
Yeah.
you made about the human capital, especially the human capital and the education. Yeah. Those are the two answers that are relevant to any society, right? I wanted to say that I work and I'm on the board of something called Pratham. I don't know how many people know about Pratham here. We are doing exactly that. We have an education system. We have a second chance, which is for women and girls. We have a vocational training program, which is doing exactly that, investing in the human capital.
No, you're exactly right. Pratham is one of my favorite NGOs.
Thank you.
I was on the Indira Gandhi Prize Committee, which gave the prize to Pratham.
Yes.
Okay,
Thank
so
you.
I know about that.
Wonderful. Thank you.